But yeah, so those big face YouTube clips, YouTube thumbnails.
Yeah, that's not us. We can't do it. I can't fake high energy.
Get
There's
some picture of like a tariff right here.
Yeah, but even that, but even in the video, like there's another channel I used to watch, Legal Eagle, which I think it's called Legal Eagle, a lawyer guy, basically. Partly, I would say it was somewhat of an inspiration for us. I mean, he does kind of the legal side. He gives sort of normal people an insight into what's happening in the legal world, and I figured we could something like that should exist for the finance world. Um, but you can tell it's an artificial amount of energy he's trying to bring, and it's I just
Yeah.
can't stand it. I wince. It's like, hey guys, you excited for some finance? Oh, can you believe it? The Fed they're just not cutting rates. It's unbelievable. And I just like I can't. Yeah, shout out to we got a comment. It was great feedback, but we can't find it in the actual comments, just in the notification. Like we get an email notification, so it's
Yeah.
still there, but we can't find it in the comments. So shout out to that person. Maybe they deleted it, so we're not going to mention their name or anything for a reason. Whatever. But I got some water and I got some comfy boots on.
Subscriber number 92. Only you know who you are.
Right, that's right. Tip of the hat. Good feedback.
Yeah. It's been another pretty head-spinning week in the world of global trade and finance. I'm sure everyone's very, very surprised to hear that at this point. Basically, all I've got to talk about week after week. Hey guys, did you hear? Tariffs were in the news again this week. How's that? Pretty good? Natural? Good. Tariffs were in the news. Amazing. Yeah, it was another head-spinning week. It was pretty crazy. We got a little bit of everything. We got more Trump strong arm threats. People came up with a new nickname for responding to these threats that he got pretty angry about. And most importantly, we saw this whole tariff regime hit the courts finally. I don't even know what to call it legally because it wasn't stopped by the courts.
We got to watch more of that
legal
legal program to know. Like,
yeah,
it was stayed by the courts. Have you ever heard that?
The week before last time we talked about tariffs, there was a lot of optimism. There was not a deal with China, but a lot of expectations for a deal. Bessent seemed confident. He thought Trump might talk with Xi by the end of the week, but that didn't happen. Into the next week, Trump starts getting angry at the EU. The EU, which was formed for the primary purpose of taking advantage of the United States on trade, has been very difficult to deal with. Powerful trade barriers, VAT taxes, corporate penalties have led to a trade deficit more than $250 billion a year. Totally unacceptable. Our discussions are going nowhere. Therefore, I'm recommending a straight 50% tariff on the European Union starting on June 1st. There's no tariff if the product is built or manufactured in the US. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So he fired this one out at the beginning of the day on Friday. So he gave markets a nice little new piece of info to panic over and be all upset about to close out the week. But then lo and behold, just about 2 days later, I received a call from the president of the European Commission requesting an extension. I agreed, of course, and July 9th now. It was my privilege to do so. Talks will begin rapidly. And again, thank you for your attention to this matter. The overall tone in financial markets, the attitude towards risk, the risk tolerance has been pretty positive. People are more willing to buy risky assets because they're, generally speaking, more optimistic about the future, whether that means lesser probability of additional tariffs, better outlook for business and GDP growth. With this back and forth, this kind of, and then sparked a new term within financial markets over the past week that Trump was not very happy with, and it's called the taco trade.
Hey, can I ask when you say the markets feel like that in your own like personal circles? What do you guys like say, or what kind of language do you use?
So it's just really an ongoing sense of just confusion and chaos. Like all things, time heals all wounds here, and people get a little more complacent about it, and it's started to drift away a little bit, but with this latest 50% on the EU, it got everyone all upset again. So things fell pretty starkly on that Friday, but then as soon as they opened up again, it's as if it didn't even happen. Things rebounded. So that's what spawned this taco trade. And so taco means Trump always chickens out.
And I think it'll be very successful. Yeah, please.
Mr. President, Wall Street analysts have coined a new term called the taco trade. They're saying Trump always chickens out on your tariff threats, and that's why markets are higher this week. What's your response to that?
I kick out?
Chicken out.
Oh, isn't that nice? Chicken out. I've never heard that. You mean because I reduced China from 145% that I set down to 100 and then down to another number? And I said you have to open up your whole country. And because I gave the European Union a 50% tax tariff, and they called up and they said, please, let's meet right now. Please, let's meet right now. And I said, okay, I'll give you till July 9. I actually asked them, I said, what's the date? Because they weren't willing to meet. And after I did what I did, they said, we'll meet anytime you want. And we have an end date of July 9th. You call that chickening out? Because we have $14 trillion now invested, committed to investing when Biden didn't have practically anything. This country was dying. You know, we have the hottest country anywhere in the world. I went to Saudi Arabia. The king told me, he said, you got the hottest we have the hottest country in the world right now. 6 months ago, this country was stone cold dead. We had a dead country. We had a country people didn't think it was going to survive. And you ask a nasty question like that. It's called negotiation. You set a number. And if you go down, if I set a number at a ridiculous high number and I go down a little bit, they want me to hold that number, 145% tariff. Even I said, man, that really got up. You know how it got? Because of fentanyl and many other things. And you added it up. I said, where are we now? We're at 145%. I said, whoa, that's high. That's high. They were doing no business whatsoever. And they were having a lot of problems. We were very nice to China. I don't know if they're going to be nice to us, but we were very nice to China. And in many ways, I think we really helped China tremendously because, they were having great difficulty because we were basically going cold turkey with China. We were doing no business because of the tariff, because it was so high. But I knew that. But don't ever say what you said. That's a nasty question. Go ahead. To me, that's the nastiest question.
The funniest part for a while was the woman behind him trying to hold back a smile. I'm not sure how to read that. But
yeah, I mean, it's like
you said you got like angry,
really
and I was listening for a little while trying to see like where is the angry part, but definitely kicked in at the end there.
It is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So from his point of view, it's this negotiating tactic. And in a way, yeah, that does make sense that he did back down, but at the same time, so China, for example, he took it from 145 down to 30, but an increase of 30% compared to before his presidency, that people would have said that that's, an enormous level. Compared to 145, it looks like he's chickening out, but the absolute level is still pretty high. But people are probably referring more so to the global tariffs that all got paused. Is he chickening out? Is he not chickening out? It's tough to say.
Hold on. So you're saying the taco trade, Trump always chickens out, would be like, see the dip now, it's going to be turned around and the market's going to go back up. So as soon as you know where the market's going, you can make a trade.
Pretty much.
Is that pretty much?
Yeah, it's like, again, whatever he says about trade, whatever you think that impact of additional tariffs would be, you just do the opposite. It's kind of like that Seinfeld episode with George Costanza. He wants to turn his life around. He only knows how to make bad decisions, though. So it's an easy fix. Just do the opposite of whatever he would normally do.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right. Yes. I will do the opposite.
And that's pretty much what was going on here.
Not financial advice. This is not financial advice.
Absolutely not. It's something people were talking about.
Just put some disclaimers.
Buy the S&P at your own risk. But the really big news this week was that these tariffs were struck down by the courts. The United States Court of International Trade, in conjunction with many of the states, they basically filed a lawsuit effectively saying these tariffs are not within the bounds of the law. Therefore, he was not in his rights to impose these tariffs. Therefore, they need to be taken down. So that was a pretty strong slap in the face, if you will, to this tariff policy.
Yeah, I guess that's what the prosecution was asking for in the court. Agreed.
I think the lawsuit came out a little while earlier, and then, yeah, it was this week that this decision came out that, yes, they are illegal and, you have to take them off.
And that's going to be appealed. Or that is they've already asked for an appeal.
Yeah, so Trump and his team, they basically instantly appealed it. And then just about a day later, this ruling was then stayed. The ruling wasn't struck down, but rather it's entering this new period where they need to reach a longer term decision on this. And in the meantime, while they're doing that, they do not have the power to strike these things down.
Just uncertainty on top of uncertainties.
It just never ends.
Well, you got to give these financial guys, something to do, right? Something to think about. You can't
Yeah,
just all be like smooth sailing and calm winds, man.
We're usually pretty bored.
Exactly. So you're welcome.
So all in all, this was a pretty big event. So Trump's team and his supporters, they point to this as another example of judges, they're typically calling them unelected bureaucrats, imposing undue power over elected officials. Whereas other people are saying the system's working exactly as intended. This is checks and balances of the judicial branch over the executive branch. This is that happening in action. We're all good. Well, which side is right? Specifically, what the Constitution says, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So it says the Congress can do that. And it doesn't say anything about the president having the ability to do that. So a lot of folks, that seemed pretty black and white. He was out of his element. He was out of his rights to do this. It should have gone through Congress. Therefore, it was illegal. So then how did he do this? In 1977, Congress passed International Emergency Economic Powers Act. These powers may be exercised to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside of the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the U.S., if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat. So if you remember back in February, whenever he implemented the very first round of tariffs of his second term, it was done under the declaration of a national emergency driven by fentanyl reaching the United States. So that seems pretty straightforward. Canada, Mexico are facilitating fentanyl produced by China into the U.S. This is producing a national emergency, in this case, a national health emergency. Therefore, the president can declare this national emergency, and then go on to deal with this unusual and extraordinary threat. He then used that as a reason to impose new tariffs globally on every country in the world. He said that these chronic deficits are presenting an economic emergency, an unusual emergency to the U.S. So that's kind of strange to me because he implemented it on every country. So how can every country be an unusual emergency?
Interesting. So this kind of looks like, in retrospect, makes a little bit more sense to maybe why you've been kind of jerked around a little bit. I imagine his lawyers are talking to him and saying you have to tie these tariffs next to this, emergency, which is the fentanyl thing, even though he never really wanted to tie it to that. And I guess maybe he kind of got away with it for the China and, Canada and Mexico part. And we talked about it at the time, and you pointed out on that episode when you said there really isn't a whole lot of fentanyl coming in from Canada. So like, what's going on? It's
like
here?
Next to nothing. Yeah.
So the answer is it was never really about the fentanyl. It was never, it was always just about the trade deficit. This was just an excuse there. And I guess maybe he took a couple steps down that road. It was successful. And then Liberation Day gave him, I guess he's like, all right, I guess we can go forward with this. That's interesting.
So that's pretty much where things stand today. He used one legal route to implement these tariffs. There's obviously been a lot of talk about what does this mean for the entire tariff policy? Are there other things that he can do, even if this does get, long-term struck down? The short answer is yes, but in general, these others are much slower moving. He doesn't have as much flexibility and authority to kind of put things on and take things off on a whim. And some are even limited by the amount of time that the tariffs can last for.
Look, we're in a situation now, big picture here is IEPA. We were using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. There's no question that there's an economic emergency with respect to both uses that we had. One is we are in a world where China has killed over 1 million Americans with fentanyl poison. And we took this step to stop that. We will continue to press on that. At the same time, we invoked that rule to stop what has been 20 million illegal aliens streaming into our country, driving down wages, taking jobs away. That's an economic emergency. And on top of that, the world continues to steal about $1 trillion a year as measured by the trade deficit. And that's an economic emergency because it's transferring our wealth abroad. So we think we have a strong case. Yes, we will immediately appeal and try to stay the ruling. But at the same time, the court, interestingly enough, basically said we were right, just use different rules and laws. So nothing has really changed here in that sense. We're still, as we speak, having countries call us and tell us they want a deal. So these deals are going to happen.
So just right there, so he talks about that IEPA Act. He goes right to the fentanyl thing. And then he goes on to say, justified by illegal immigration, somehow that can be fixed by imposing tariffs on other countries. That's a pretty shaky argument there.
I think we're kind of, I don't want to say splitting hairs, but there's an important distinction here that you made earlier that he's kind of trying to, I don't want to say avoid, but the reason why it was struck down based on what you had told me earlier was because it was applying this 10%, just this broad-based tariff to every country. And that's why it doesn't really, the emergency doesn't match what he's trying to do with it. But what he's trying to do here is reinvoke sort of the specifically China, and he kind of go back to the fentanyl. The people coming into the country, is he implying that those are all Chinese or something? He used certainly language I don't think that would stand up or hold up very easily in court. I think he said that like China killed. I think he just drew a straight line, just said like China did this, China killed these people. And then he also said like foreigners stole was the word, stole $1 trillion. It's like, look, I don't like the trade deficit either. But certainly if you're trying to look credible, you gotta, I think, be accurate or at least be like
level-headed. It's a pretty odd way of characterizing things.
Yeah. So, okay. I hadn't really heard this guy speak, but, opinions are being formed. I'll just say that way.
Yeah. This guy, Peter Navarro, he had a pretty big hand in Trump's first term trade policy. And he's known as being like a very much supportive of tough measures against China. The way he said that, I think he really does see a trade deficit as countries stealing. There's a lot of ways you can interpret a deficit, but he's got a very narrow one and a very, very opinionated one.
One of the things, maybe we can dig into this a little more depth later, but I almost feel as though that kind of running a huge trade deficit just ensures that there are U.S. assets, i.e. like dollars, out there in the world. Like it kind of we remain to be the global reserve currency, which is super important because of the trade deficit. I just wonder, there's got to be a linkage there.
That's like one of the quote unquote prices you have to pay to be the global reserve currency. So it comes with a lot of benefits, but there's downsides as well. You have to run these continual deficits just because there is so much demand for US dollars all over the world for things entirely unrelated to direct trade with the US. So other foreign countries will effectively use treasuries like cash, like collateral for some trade with one country to some other country. So the role of the US dollar and, US treasuries effectively in that case is just so wide. And that's one of the impacts of these, certainly supports the continuation of these chronic trade deficits.
Still have tons of options. And you alluded to one of them. You will, of course, appeal, but could you describe what you might do in the interim, the way you might pursue your ultimate objective anyway, with the tools you have still available to you?
I'm gonna let Jameson Greer, the USTR, inform you on that, and you'll be hearing from him soon on that. But I mean, look, any trade lawyer knows there's just a number of different options we can take. If you look at the kind of things we've already done, it kind of give you a roadmap on that. There's all sorts of numbers out there. There's 122, there's 301, there's 232, there's 338. There's all sorts of things we can do well within the law. But look, we think that what we've done already is perfect.
Yeah, so he doesn't go into great detail there, but he starts to touch on those different laws that do exist, different routes that could be used with which to implement these tariffs, assuming that this first route does indeed get struck down over the long term. But again, no matter what it is, so some of these explicitly have like time windows. Like I think one of them, section 122, they have like tariffs can be imposed for a maximum of 150 days. So it comes with a deadline at the outset. So I don't know, from Trump's perspective, I'm sure that's seen as, you lose quite a bit of leverage if you do that. If you use it as a threat, the other country can just say, oh, we can wait out 5 months. Some of the other ones, 301, 338, not going to go into detail here, but they're a little more flexible, but it would almost certainly require substantially more time to implement them. So what does this mean for the overall trade strategy, for the overall foreign policy?
So have eased the power taken away in terms of him being able to just issue tariffs to anyone that
just, in the middle of the night, fire off a tweet saying 50% on whatever country he feels like.
What does that mean? Well, politically, I guess politically it would be a disaster for Trump, right? I mean, he made all these promises, coming in, going to fix it, and then just be stopped dead like that. That would be politically a disaster. Economically or financially, it seems to be that the markets, at least, and this is both the bond as well as the stock, take news of ceasing tariffs, so like no tariffs, to be a positive thing. So it'd be almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess like financially or economically, it would be a boon. It'd be a good thing.
It's a little trickier, particularly in the bond markets. In the process of writing up this new tax bill, there's some level of assumption of additional tax revenue from these tariffs. So I think the Trump administration says like $2 trillion a year. That seems almost certainly too high. And we're just seeing some of the elevated numbers come in, but we did see a record high amount come in over April. I think it was on the order of like 25 billion or so, when in the past it was like a few billion every month. So it was substantially more. So if you scale that up throughout the year, it's certainly not 2 trillion, but on the order of like a couple hundred billion. And this tax bill, it's over this 10-year period, it's supposed to increase the deficit somewhere 300 to 400 per year. But if you incorporate these tariffs, you say maybe 200 billion a year, that number's a lot smaller. Now, you're still just net adding to the deficit each year, but this is something that would have helped that tax bill get through. But there's also a factor of like some of the trust in this global trading system has been shaken. So if you do all that with no benefit really, and just to shake your outlook over the long term, it's difficult to see material upside here.
Well, do you really think though that it was shaken? I could take the opposite side and say, kind of evoke what we had read last week in the Moody's. And they were talking about how the one of the benefits of the United States, one of the real strengths as to why it was given such a high rating so far, is the strength of its institutions. And in this sense, if it does get completely knocked down, I think that would be a note of being positive for the strength, quote unquote, the strength of the institutions. One person can't just come in and shake everything up. This was an example of checks and balances working, so that so like the taco trade is a kind of an example of an instance where stability is like is a real thing. Now it comes about certainly, and it really, as though we're in theater or something. It's certainly dramatic. No one's ever said that like American politics wasn't interesting. or exciting or whatever. And so, sure. But, the system, collect all of it, is leading to the result that, it's not being super shaken up. So I don't know. I would take the other side of that. In terms of confidence, it's just proven again that this system is a little noisy entertainment, but it's stable. It's predictable. It's not like, and, again, for one of the biggest lessons that I learned when living in Russia and China was that, it's stability is like the most important thing, in terms of economic growth and driving business investment and stuff like that. You need stability. You need financially stable. So you need to know where the value of your currency is going to be in a year. It can't just be inflating down to nothing. Politically, it has to be stable. There can't be like huge, different regimes coming in and changing everything. Legally, it has to be stable. So the laws aren't going to be changed on a whim, and that the courts actually are meaningful. There's predictability there. All of it down the line. And, in Russia and China, they didn't have that. And so they know what it means not to have it for a period of time. In Russia in the 90s, and certainly China, long time ago. But you can do it with like a very strong hand, or you could do it with kind of our system, I guess.
System working as intended. That's always a good thing. Now, its impact on trade and the deficit, not so sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing is like, well, why did we want this to happen in the first place? And that was to bring jobs back to the United States. So in that sense, if, we go back to the old ways, and, the old ways is pre-Trump, so it's not that long ago. And that's disaster is a strong word, but that's not a good thing. I mean, the reason why he was elected was to kind of get jobs back, to help out those that were left behind by the whole globalist system. And that system has, if this goes through, it's going to be a knock on that effort.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, certainly politically,
but even just like the material effort of bringing manufacturing jobs and stuff like that back. This was his way of doing it. And so they're not going to come back, and that's a bad thing. The idea was that it was not fair. It was that it was not a level playing field. Was that the reason why? And so we show earlier there were some estimates as the number of jobs that had left because of the trade deficit and all that, and like why it's cheaper to manufacture something abroad. And so the companies that left, it wasn't necessarily because the U.S. or it was because the U.S. was inherently less competitive, but it wasn't necessarily because like the labor or something was worse. It was because there were unfair practices. That was that like 300-page document detailing all the ways in which, foreign policies, governments put a hand on the scale. And what the tariffs were here to do was to push it back down on the other side. That was the way. So they were looking at tariffs, and tariffs is just a simple number that could be used. But what if you couldn't use some of the same techniques that were used, but that you kind of put a finger to and pointed and said, these are unfair practices. So like by an example, make them go through ridiculously bureaucratic processes to, get their products approved here in the US or something. Stuff like that. I mean,
right.
if that really is their goal,
Non-tariff
is to
barriers.
just put the hand, exactly, just impose some of our own non-tariff barriers. If in fact the goal is to kind of level set that, what were the discussions like in the back rooms about just putting some of those there? I agree. It's like un-American, things like that. We want to achieve the, ideal of free trade. But if tariffs doesn't do it, then why don't you just hose them down in a whole bunch of bureaucracy or something? And then, as for what does it mean to bring the manufacturing jobs back? I think there's the whole sense of the supply chain reliance. Like you just don't want to be reliant entirely. You want to have like a domestic, and that is like a national security thing. But, the other thing you could do, you could lower regulations on your side. You could, make sure electricity is super cheap, all that kind of stuff. And that's stuff the government could do. We mentioned before that these tariffs we thought were just like a short-term thing. They're just kind of something you put in place, but the play, like the long play, is to lower the, and they mention this, and this is something Besant wants to do, is to lower the bureaucratic and regulatory burden. They want to
increase market access.
Increase market access. They want to make energy really cheap and abundant. All that plays towards the longer game. Tariffs are just a temporary thing to kind of start the factories getting put here or something. So I thought, I mean, it's not the tariff isn't the end goal. The end game is to have the other countries lower down those non-tariff barriers and then to increase our own competitiveness. And then you'd kind of lower the tariffs. I imagine in his mind, that's probably what he was hoping for. That
bring
kind
about
of makes
fairness.
sense.
Yeah.
Again, fairness as defined by the trade deficit. And, if you wanted to look, and then there was kind of a sound point there in that, if you wanted to get to good evidence of it being fair or not, has to do with the trade deficit, because in pure economic theory and a completely free market, it should sort of even out. And we pointed out earlier that it's not just because that we consume more that we have to, we have to have these trade deficits. That doesn't hold up, I think, logically for a couple of reasons. But, one of the examples, more simple ones you can point to, is that just in the field of services, we have a trade surplus. And then you would also expect, if that were the case, that, the number two economy would also, if you backed out the US, they would also be running a trade deficit. And that's not the case. But yeah, I mean, it's a shame. And we were like at the beginning, a month or two ago, we were hoping that Trump would be successful in bringing back manufacturing. And now that this is kind of being turned around, we have to, I think it would be fair to point out kind of the opposite side of that and be disappointed. It's not obvious that we've had that emotion, but it wouldn't be fair to say that I didn't feel some disappointment that this isn't going to work. I mean, I would like to see manufacturing come back.
One of the important details about this court case that just happened is that it doesn't apply to every tariff that was imposed, but it applies to most of them. However, it does not apply to those on steel and aluminum and on cars. So this isn't a sweeping ruling that you can't issue any tariffs under this capacity, but the other ones are there still. So within the narrower goal of bringing back manufacturing, those are some of the core areas that, should tariffs be an effective tool to bring it back, I would still have reason to believe that, that could still happen through this route.
Oh, interesting. That's an important point.
Yeah, probably should have brought that up earlier, but too many legal docs. All right, well, yeah, that's it. That's all that happened this week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Root of All Evil podcast. I'm Luke.
I'm Joe. See you next time.